It all comes down to 2 days. Selection Sunday is coming up quicker than any of us realize. Today, Friday, March the 9th, 2 days away from Selection Sunday. Kevin Sweeney, Brad Cavallero coming to you from the CBB Central podcast. And Brad, uh, how you doing, man? This week has been nuts. There's so many games every single day, whether it's starting at noon or starting at late hours of the night. How are you handling all this basketball?
I'm doing great, Kevin. Yesterday was actually the first day I got to watch from noon to 2 a.m. That is, just straight. Didn't even leave the house during that span. So I mean, that's a perfect day for me.
Yeah, it was a great day. I was watching, from the Colin Sexton buzzer beater to the Middle Tennessee State upset, all day. I was watching hoops. It was wonderful. And that kind of brings us into the first thing we wanted to talk about today, and that's kind of breaking down yesterday and what a wild day it was. Maybe not some of the big name upsets you might have expected, but certainly some madness and certainly some huge games that have a big impact on the bubble. What was your biggest takeaway from yesterday, Brad?
So I think the point about there weren't a lot of upsets. That I think is a good thing because now we have these heavyweight matchups going into Friday and Saturday, where a team like UNC, they were on the ropes early against Miami. They were down 14-0. They come back and win, set up this big game against Duke tonight. So I think the storyline was kind of most teams that were supposed to win won and kind of held serve. It's going to set us up for a even better end of the week. And then I think the bubble picture, as crazy as it may sound, actually got clearer, even though there's about 12 teams, I think, for 6 spots up for grabs. And that is clearer than it was yesterday.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wanted to talk about the bubble kind of as my point. I think, in my opinion, the bubble became a little less clear just because no one's playing. I think in years past, there's been a pretty steady process of teams who could kind of make noise in their final couple games of the conference tournament and make a run and really assert themselves as in the tournament. And if you look at Joe Lunardi's bracketology, you look at the last 4 in and the first 4 out right now. These are all teams for the most part that are done. I know Alabama's still in, but they have Auburn today. That's certainly a huge challenge. UCLA's in. They still have, I believe, Arizona on the docket today. And so when you look at things from that perspective, it becomes difficult to project the bracket because everyone's done and we're just debating these teams. And there's this kind of push and pull between teams like Oklahoma State who have terrible RPIs but awesome wins, and then teams like Middle Tennessee State who went down yesterday, who have great RPIs and did everything they could, but just don't have the top tier wins to put them in the big dance.
Yeah, that's a great point. I noticed that myself because I think UCLA, Kansas State, and Providence, I think that they played their way into the field yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
and they're still playing today. But then I would say USC and Alabama and then the Bid Thieves are the only teams that aren't quite in yet and are still playing. I know that Jerry Palm from CBS had been talking a lot about how he doesn't think Alabama is going to get in because no team has gotten an at-large with less than 4 games over 500. If Alabama were to lose today to Auburn, they would be 18-15. But the more I look at Alabama, the more I can't leave them out. I mean, I think a lot of the comparisons to Vanderbilt last year, who was the first 15-loss team to get an at-large. Vanderbilt had the number 2 strength of schedule last year and a 42 RPI. Alabama has the fifth ranked strength of schedule this year. They have a RPI in the 40s as well, and both teams have their fair share of really big wins and even wins over tournament teams away from home.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to me in that Alabama has 6 quadrant 1 wins. That's certainly a number that's a very solid number, and especially given the fact that they only have 7 losses against that group. So they did pretty well in that regard. Their metrics look good other than that strength of record number. So in my opinion, this is an NCAA tournament team. The one thing I will point to with Alabama is the potential for wins or losses to move over the next couple of days from group to group. So Florida is at 37 in the RPI. That loss right now, that's a quadrant 2, could become a quadrant 1. looking at some other ones that could definitely move. UCF's at 77 in the RPI. A 75 or below home win would be a Group 2 loss instead of a Group 3 loss. So that would certainly be beneficial, as well as a road loss at Ole Miss that is sitting at 138. That could flop into 135 and then be a Group 2 loss as well. So that could certainly help their resume just a little bit. But, to me, I agree with all three teams you listed as kind of playing their ways into the field. Personally, I'm not entirely sure why Kansas State isn't considered a little safer than they are. I feel like what they've done overall is pretty solid. I know they have a loss to Tulsa, which isn't very good. But, overall, to me, this is an NCAA tournament team.
Yeah, definitely, especially because they got that win yesterday over TCU. And, Tulsa is not a very good team, but they're sneaky 12-6 in the AAC. Looking at some of Kansas State's other notable results, they have a win over they have a sweep over Oklahoma State. They have they have a sweep over Baylor. They have 2 out of 3 over TCU. They beat Georgia, who's another bubble team. They have a win over Oklahoma. So I think why Kansas State might be lower than you would expect is, even though that they were 10-8 in a truly round robin conference, and in the conference which I think is the best in America, they lost both to Kansas, they lost both to West Virginia, and they lost both to Texas Tech. So that was the clear 3 in that conference. So they didn't get any upsets, and they didn't lose any games that they were supposed to win. So they kind of stuck in the middle, kind of the epitome of an 8 or 9 seed in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I completely agree there on Kansas State. And I think another team that we should be looking out at as a bubble team is Middle Tennessee State. And this is a team that got stunned yesterday in conference tournament play against, let's be honest, a not good Southern Miss team. I know Doc Sadler's done a good job trying to get that program back where it needs to be, but this team is not a very good club. Came in under 500. This is a game that Middle Tennessee State had to win. It's certainly right now the worst mark on their resume. Brad, I've seen a lot of fluctuation in terms of whether people think they will get in. I know Eli Bettger, who was on the show a couple weeks back, tweeted at me that Middle Tennessee has a slim to no chance of getting an at-large just because of their lack of wins against at-large competition. But Joe Lunardi still has them in as a last 4-in team. Where do you see them with this resume? I think it's one of the more interesting resumes, and choosing over them and say maybe an Oklahoma State will be a really interesting test case for how the committee's looking at things like the RPI and road wins.
Yeah, so when I said earlier that there were 12 teams for 6 spots, I even narrowed it down further to 7 teams for 6 spots, and not 7 teams that I think have a chance, 7 teams that if I were the committee, I would put in. So it really came down to the last spot between Arizona State and Middle Tennessee State, and whether that would be a very compelling first 4 matchup, because you have this dichotomy between the Power 5 team that kind of slumped to the finish and this mid-major that did as well as they could, but unfortunately lost in the conference tournament. I think seeing where the committee would go between those 2 type of teams, it's literally a coin flip, because people mentioned with Vanderbilt last year about how they were unprecedented when getting an at-large, but they had won 7 of their last 8 games, and their only loss in that span was to Kentucky. While Arizona State is slumping to the finish line. Clearly Middle Tennessee doesn't have the wins, but if they are to get in the field, I think you kind of have to just push resume aside and go with the fact that they passed the eye test, which is not very promising.
Right. It's a challenge. I think, the things they have in their favor is the fact they have 12 road wins on the season. They're 12-1 on the road. I think that's certainly impressive, and something the committee says they want to emphasize is road wins, and that's certainly reflected in the quadrant system. They have 3 quadrant 1. They have 3 quadrant 1 road wins, which is something that I find pretty impressive. They've beaten Western Kentucky, Murray State, and Old Dominion. I think their RPI sitting at 32 is certainly a beneficial number for them. They have a really strong strength of schedule, the 8th best strength of schedule in the non-conference in college basketball. So I think that certainly will help their case. But at the same time, they have two group quadrant 3 losses and a quadrant 4 loss. Those will be tough ones to shake. And I mean, their quadrant 1 wins, even though they are quadrant 1, aren't exactly, brand name wins. You beat Murray State, Western Kentucky, and Old Dominion, 3 really solid basketball teams. But when you're comparing that to a resume of an Arizona State, who has a win over Kansas and a win over Xavier, both on road or neutral floors, it becomes a really big challenge, for the committee to put them in. I'm certainly hopeful that they get in, but the more I think about it, I'd put it more like a 35% chance. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, definitely. And I think for these playing games, I think the most compelling matchups would be Arizona State, Middle Tennessee, and then Oklahoma and St. Mary's. Take these two mid-major powers versus these two kind of underachieving, star-laden high major teams.
Yeah, and you bring up St. Mary's, and that's another interesting team, but we have not really gotten to too much on this podcast in terms of their at-large hopes, because to me, this team doesn't deserve to be in the NCAA tournament. I watch them and I say, yes, this is an NCAA tournament team. But after this BYU loss, I mean, the resume just isn't good. And I kind of went on a Twitter storm on them on Monday night about this. It's that I don't feel bad for them in the slightest. They walked away from contracts and opportunities to play games against legitimate competition, whether it was walking away from a home and home against Nevada or walking away from a road game at Grand Canyon. Yes, Grand Canyon didn't wind up being quite as good, but still would have been a solid game on their schedule. I believe they also walked away, trying to remember they walked away from an opportunity to play Rhode Island, I believe, as well. I mean, they had these opportunities to go play people, and yet Randy Bennett continues every year to say, we're going to buy home games. We're not going to leave the state of California for our non-conference. They played every single non-conference game either at home or within 45 minutes drive from their arena. Those were their 2 road games, San Jose State and Cal, except for their exempt event, which was in Southern California. And they fell on their face in that event. They have some bad losses now with the two group 3 losses. To me, they have 2 quadrant 1 wins over Gonzaga and BYU. The BYU quadrant 1 win doesn't really do anything for me. To me, this isn't a tournament team with their resume. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and I would just like to point out first, a lot of people have criticized the quadrant system, and I think unfairly in the past few weeks. And one of their main points that they cite is, St. Mary's loses to BYU and they gain a quadrant 1 win. But no matter what the system is, if it has any sort of ranking of teams and you play a team twice, the second time you play the team and they beat you, they're going to move up, which is going to give the first result a better impact. It doesn't matter what the delineation is, if it's a top 10 team, top 20, top 200. If no matter how, if the system ranks teams in some way and you play a team twice, it will always happen. It's the most unwarranted kind of silly criticism I've seen in a while.
Yeah.
And
yeah, we saw this last year with RPI top 50. It was something that people said all the time. Maybe that win will sneak into the RPI top 50, or that win changed it to as a top 50 win. It's ridiculous to me. I was just going to bring up the same point. Excellent one, Brad.
And then, you mentioned that last year, essentially what a quadrant 1 win, or the go-to criteria, the most desired criteria, was a top 50 RPI win. So technically, you could beat the 50th best team at home and the 51st best team on the road, and the 50th at home would be considered a better win, which is ludicrous. So another reason why, I don't know where this criticism started. Probably Jay Billis or someone who just criticized everything for the sake of it. But everyone has this kind of expectation that this quadrant system is ruining the selection committee, where even with the undeniably poorer RPI top 50 system, what really goes wrong in terms of this? What really goes wrong in terms of the selection process? Maybe but one or two teams are in that you don't think, or like Wichita State was like maybe 2 or 3 seed lines underrated. But overall, it no matter what the criteria is, it has a very little impact from a macro perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that's an excellent point. But going back to St. Mary's, this is the stat that I just found the ability to look at. Now it's one of my favorites. St. Mary's average RPI for a Division One win is 194. They have 5 wins over bottom 300 teams, 2 more against number 285 in Portland, two more against 265 Santa Clara, and 2 more against 259 Loyola Marymount. This resume is thin, man. They've played, they've played, I believe, 26 of their games have been against Group 3 or Group 4 opponents. I just, if what we're trying to do is reward teams for scheduling the right way, putting St. Mary's in the NCAA tournament is a direct opposite of what the message we're trying to send.
That's an excellent point. And when they signed up for the Wooden Legacy, I think they would think it would be a stronger field because the PK80 Invitational kind of took the air out of a lot of these other tournaments. But in that tournament, they lost to Washington State on a neutral floor, who's not a good team, and they lost to Georgia, who is an NIT team. So even these kind of chances to pick up like a win over a Power 5, they didn't get them. And then with the URI point on the CBS podcast, Gary Parrish said that URI was even willing to do, instead of a home and home, a neutral and neutral, like play in Brooklyn and play in San Francisco or whatever. And St. Mary's still wouldn't do it. So at that point, Randy Bennett is kind of just, I don't even know what he's doing. He's like stubborn to the point where it's going to cost his team a bid. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and I know there's been similar reporting from Chris Murray over at the Reno Gazette-Journal, who covers Nevada, and he said that no, they would only do a bye game with Nevada. Nevada, they played a bye game last year, and Eric Musselman was hoping to set that up as a series going forward. And St. Mary said, no, we'll play you in our building, but we'll never go to your building. And I just don't understand the philosophy, especially given St. Mary's has been burned before, and Randy Bennett should understand that this is a problem, and he hasn't moved on. I think he believes that he'll get in if he wins enough games every year and just gets to that number. And for the most part, it's worked out. So I guess I can understand why. But this team is a team that came into the year as an expected top 20 team, a team that you were trying to build a resume towards the big dance and maybe being a top 6 seed. And they just flat out, they ruined it for themselves in terms of, even if they had gotten in, even if they had won the WCC's tournament, the best seed they would have gotten would have been what? Like a 7, 8 seed? Even that seems a little high to me. They just set themselves up for a failure before the season even began.
Yeah, maybe Randy Bennett's hoping that BYU and Gonzaga move to the Mountain West so he can just play an even weaker schedule and beat up on those remaining WCC teams and get that automatic bid in that 12 seed every year.
Yeah, I mean, if that's what he wants to do, that's fine. I think that would be I would be really interested if those two teams do move to the Mountain West. I'm sure we can kind of discuss that more in depth in the offseason when there's less games to be discussed. But the ripple effect of that could just be super fascinating. Brad, anything else from yesterday and from the last couple of days in terms of bubble teams?
So Alabama really lucked out. That Colin Sexton buzzer beater was a direct result of Texas A&M just not picking him up until half court. They just let him get a full head of steam to the basket and score. So that was kind of crazy. And Avery Johnson should be thanking his lucky stars. It is also worth noting that supposedly Avery Johnson kind of set up that Texas A&M team. Like when his son was there, he supposedly did like a ton of recruiting and got them all these like great players. And now he's the coach of Alabama, and they gave him this season-changing win. And then the other really compelling result from yesterday was, I think, Butler beating Seton Hall behind a huge game from Kamar Baldwin.
Yeah, good calls on both of those. And I kind of wanted to touch on this Alabama game because I watched the vast majority of it, partially during class. It was a great way to spend an hour that I was supposed to be learning something, and then partially just um, kind of just spending some time while I was supposed to be studying, doing some work, watching some games. It was a wonderful game to watch, and I mean, when Starks hit that shot late, I mean, I was just picturing the Alabama fan base, Twitter sphere, just going insane with just criticism of Coach Johnson and everything that's kind of happened there, but. Sexton was awesome in this one. I think he's drawn a lot of criticism, especially amongst draft people. I listened to a few draft podcasts. I know the Game Theory podcast with Sam Vecini is one of my favorites, and they've kind of criticized Sexton's play in terms of being a little bit out of control and not really being able to shoot the basketball. But he was awesome in this one. He just didn't let them lose. And I mean, what an athletic play. I mean, certainly A&M should not have let him get as much space as it did, because when you're so athletic and get ahead of steam going downhill, it was wide open for him to go get that bucket. But at the same time, to get up and down the floor in 4 seconds, first of all, is just an insanely athletic play. And then also his ability to go off the wrong foot and then do an underhand scoop layup without the glass, a complete swish through the net, was just an incredible move. And also, the real MVP of that, I don't know if you watched the replay several times, is the Alabama cameraman. I know we don't have video on this podcast, but I encourage all of you to go look at this video, because the team mobs Sexton right under the rim, and the cameraman is getting like trampled by these Alabama players, and he just keeps backing up, trying to keep his camera in the shot, trying to get a photo. Respect to that guy for doing his job.
Yeah, I actually saw that today. that was very funny. And then another thing that I had tweeted out yesterday in the Providence Creighton game, an all-time missed call.
Oh, I saw this. Yeah,
where they called that out of bounds. It was literally 2 or 3 feet in bounds. So what happened was, so the refs are reviewing the play. I thought to check if the shot hit the rim to reset the shot clock, but they're over there for like 10 minutes. And on the Fox Sports 1 broadcast, they keep on showing this replay of who touches it last, either Isaiah Jackson for PC or Kyrie Thomas for Creighton. But they're showing who touches it before it goes out of bounds. So they keep on showing them touching it. And then the picture I took is where it lands after they touched it, which is 2 feet in bounds. And then the ball is going out of bounds, and Kyrie Thomas goes to save it, and he's out of bounds while he saves it and knocks it out of bounds. So there's no debate. It's Providence ball. They come back and they give the ball to Creighton because they didn't watch the whole play. They just watched who touched it second to last. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, that was really bad. And I mean, a game of that magnitude, to have that type of missed call, it could have been, devastating. But a huge shot, I believe it was Cartwright who hit the shot to send it to overtime.
Diallo had like this kind of second, third chance putback.
Oh, yeah.
Cartwright in overtime hit like this spinning kind of fade layup to go up 4, which is necessary because free throws were at a premium in this game.
That's what I was remembering. Yeah, I mean, and what are your thoughts on this Providence team? I think they're in the field at this point. I thought they were a little safer than people gave them credit for before, just because they have the wins over Villanova and over Xavier. I mean, but there's some definite talent on this team, but there's some definite flaws. This team isn't deep. They're not getting much from Drew Edwards, Mekhi Ashton Langford, Nate Watson, Khalif Young, those guys. I mean, where do you see this kind of going?
Yeah, so I think that they're locked in now, and a win today over Xavier would safely put them out of the first 4. I think that they have a better than 50% chance of avoiding the first 4 anyway. But yeah, you're exactly right. Where like coming into the season, everyone thought that this was going to be like the deepest Providence team in years. They cited Ashton Langford and Watson and all these additions, plus the top 8 from last year returning, making this a deeper team. But Mekhi Ashton Langford has been totally ineffective. Watson is so flawed to the point where in the second half you can't even play him because he's so bad on defense. There was one point yesterday where he got in for a few minutes in the first half, and I think Marcus Foster goes to drive, and instead of even like taking one step forward to like help, he just turned his head and watched his Foster got like a wide open dunk, and that was it for him the rest of the game. I think Khalif Young is good enough to play, but he's not very good on offense. And Creighton was going with a more perimeter oriented lineup, so that just wasn't the matchup for him. I would expect him to play a lot today against Xavier, who have more like traditional low post big men. But a lot of inconsistent play, especially from their veterans. I think more than likely this is this team's capped at like the second round of the NCAA tournament. They'll probably be like a 10 seed and lose to like a Duke or a Purdue in that second round.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me, Brad. The other thing I kind of wanted to touch on is bid stealers, and this is going to be really interesting with the bubble as kind of tenuous as it is. We might have had one in the Conference USA with Middle Tennessee State. It's kind of unclear because they're so close to the bubble, but there's a few conferences where there's a very real chance of a bid stealer. Looking at the Mountain West, Nevada's in. I think most experts agree that they're going to be pretty safely in the field, regardless of what happens. But the four teams remaining, Nevada, San Diego State, they'll play tonight, and as well as New Mexico and Utah State. Boise State got bounced by the Aggies yesterday. So there's a chance there for a bid stealer if San Diego State can upset Nevada, or the winner of that Utah State New Mexico ball game can steal a bid, as well as in the Atlantic 10. I think most people think St. Bonaventure's okay, although if they lost to Richmond tonight, I don't know that they'd be pretty close, in my opinion. If one of Rhode Island or St. Bonaventure doesn't win this conference tournament, that'll steal a bid. And then any other leagues that you could see a bid stealer coming from? Just kind of looking up and down, maybe Temple could make a run.
I actually think the league with the biggest bid stealer potential is the Pac-12, because we have Utah and Oregon tonight. The winner is going to play the winner of Arizona and UCLA. And I think Arizona and UCLA are both safely in. So the winner of this USC Oregon game, will be one win away from the big dance. And I think USC is being considered as a pretty safely in. I haven't even been seeing them in a lot of first fours, but I don't think that they've beaten a at-large team. They have a neutral court win over Middle Tennessee. They have a neutral court win over New Mexico State, who's not an at-large, and then their next best wins are at Oregon and at Utah. So that is very, very thin. They have a lot of wins just from the current state of the Pac-12. Then Oregon was a big disappointment this year, but they are 2 games away from automatic berth. I do agree that the Mountain West is probably the second most likely, just because Nevada's a little banged up. Lindsey Drew is out, but I think that Nevada is much better than the 3 other teams in the field.
Yeah, it should be interesting. I actually picked San Diego State to win the Mountain West tournament. They've been playing some really excellent basketball the last few games. They've kind of ramped it up on the defensive end. They've won, I believe, 7 straight now. Yeah, they beat Nevada to close the season. They beat Boise State as well. Had a very solid win yesterday over Fresno. Trey Kell's been playing some wonderful basketball in kind of his last chance as a senior. And I think that's always something that should never be overlooked. And I've said this a few times, is never overlook, seniors trying to make an NCAA tournament. This San Diego State group hasn't kind of lived up to what it was expected to be between Kell and Malik Pope, such a decorated recruiting class. And so to those guys, I'm sure they're trying like crazy to get to one more NCAA tournament and kind of find a way into the field and try to make something happen. And they're playing really good ball right now. They're getting something from their bench. Matt Mitchell and Jalen McDaniels are a really promising group of freshmen. So, this San Diego State team, it wouldn't surprise me at all if they knocked off the Wolfpack tonight and went to the Mountain West Championship game. And then how about Paul Weir and New Mexico? They're going to be favored tonight, probably by 4 or 5 points to beat Utah State. I think they're a pretty clear favorite in my opinion. And then they'll be 1 win away from the NCAA tournament. Just kind of speaks to the job that Paul Weir's done. I don't love that matchup against Nevada, but I mean, if they could somehow steal a bid, given all the roster turnover this offseason and what Paul Weir had to deal with coming into that program after Craig Neal, it would be coach of the year type material.
Yeah, I totally agree on the point with Weir and the Lobos, but it is also worth noting that next year New Mexico has so much high major talent coming in that they could really find themselves at the top of the Mountain West. They have Vance Jackson coming in, who's a shooter, like a 6'7" combo forward from UConn. They have Jaquan Lyle, who's a former like top 30 recruit, played at Ohio State. He's like a big physical point guard. And they may even be getting Carlton Bragg, who's a former 5-star who couldn't find his way at Kansas or Arizona State, and now is on this New Mexico roster. And then a funny note about San Diego State and their senior class. I remember when Xavier Thames was going to graduate, and people were saying, don't worry about next year. The Aztecs have this great point guard coming in, Trey Kell. And Trey Kell comes in and he struggles as a freshman. And I saw a ton of people be like, don't worry about Kell struggling. He'll be able to move to his natural position. And we have this great freshman coming in, Jeremy Hemsley. And neither of them were capable point guards. And then last year I saw people say, oh, don't worry, Devin Watson's coming in. And Watson's been good, but I don't think any of the three of them lived up to the lofty expectations that were put on them after Xavier Thames graduated.
Yeah, no, that's a good call. They've had some talent come through. They just haven't really had the pieces to fit together. They've not really been the elite defense the last couple of years that I think they've been in the past. That certainly hasn't helped, and they just haven't fit together. But they're certainly peaking at the right time, and I think they have a really, really good chance to make a run here. So, plenty of more tournaments to wrap up with over the next 3 days. Which one are you looking forward to the most, Brad? A lot of action, whether it's mid-major leagues that are going to have teams that could win games in the NCAA tournament, duking it out, or some of these bigger conferences like the SEC's got some really interesting stuff. The Pac-12, as we mentioned before, the ACC tournament's always a fun one. What are you looking forward to most the next few days?
So one thing that I always root for is for these mid-major number one seeds to win their conference tournament, because it gives us the best chance at an NCAA tournament upset. And it kind of quells the people that want to end conference tournaments. So teams like Montana, New Mexico State, I would have said Middle Tennessee State, but they're already gone. But hopefully either Old Dominion or Western Kentucky wins that league. And then other than that, I think I'm most looking forward to the ACC tournament. Hoping for another Duke Virginia rematch. They gave us a really compelling game earlier in the season. What are you looking up? What are you looking out for, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. There's so much action that I can't wait for. I'm looking forward to the Big 12. I know there may not be quite as much on the line in terms of bids because they've all been locked up, but there's so much seeding is on the line. We've got Kansas State and Kansas tonight. That's always a fun rivalry game. Kansas State played Kansas really tough both times, and I think that this Kansas State team has as much to gain today as any team that's not on the bubble. In terms of what they could do seed-wise with a win over Kansas, a Kansas team that doesn't have Udoka as a bouquet. And then West Virginia, Texas Tech is going to be really fun just with those guards and then the championship there. Really, really looking forward to that tournament, as well as I always love the A-10 tournament. I don't know why. I mean, especially this year because it's just kind of a mess. But I mean, there's 4 games today, and I can't wait for all of them. Rhode Island's playing VCU as we speak. VCU, I think, will give Rhode Island their best shot and kind of compete at least. George Mason is, I think, 10-1 in games decided by 5 points or less. Just some ridiculous stat like that. They're going to have St. Joe's today, and then that winner will get to take on Rhode Island or VCU. Then St. Bonaventure's on the bubble. They have Richmond today. That's a big one. And then as well as Davidson, who I picked to win this tournament, the team that's playing great basketball of late and could be a bid stealer. So I'm really looking forward to just seeing how this tournament plays out. It's always a fun one. And I think it's also going to be interesting because the championship for that one is on Sunday. And so when there's so much moving parts that could go there with a bid stealer potentially with a St. Bonaventure team who I think is still closer to the bubble than a lot of people think, it could be really interesting coming down, bearing down on the hours towards Selection Sunday, having things moving and shaking. And certainly an A-10 tournament game could really get some great ratings if there's a bid stealer on the line.
Yeah, that's a very good point about the Atlantic 10, especially because some of these teams like VCU has so much talent. I think VCU might be the second most talented team in the league, but somehow this season finished eighth. I don't know really how that happened. I haven't seen a ton of their games in conference. I did see three of their four non-conference games. They have a solid senior point guard in Jonathan Williams. They have the best big man in the conference in Justin Tillman, and they have a couple really good wings with Isaac Van and Dariante Jenkins, and they're pretty deep, and they have a strong group of newcomers, and yet they finished in eighth in a very down year for the Atlantic 10. I think St. Joe's, if they were healthy this year, I think would have 100% been an NCAA tournament team because they actually played pretty well even without Lamar Kimball and Charlie Brown, who were two of their starters. And then George Mason is a team to look out for in the future because I think they only lose one player off this team, and they have Jared Reuter coming in, who was a former Virginia big man, who was like their backup center. He's like a low post kind of player, and they've gotten two or three really good big man recruits too. I think AJ Wilson was one, and Gonar Mar another, who I think were freshmen this year. So the future's looking up for George Mason, and maybe they can string together a win or two in this tournament to kind of build on future prospects.
Yeah, George Mason's a really interesting club, and I will say Coach Paulson is one of the best coaches for my money at the mid-major level in college basketball. The guy just does more with less. I love Otis Livingston as a point guard. He's super fun to watch. And Gonar Mar, as you mentioned, is such an interesting talent. At 6'7", 6'8", he's had to play out of position because they're so thin up front this season. But he can stretch the floor. He's comfortable putting the ball on the deck. He's got solid vision, although he does need to improve a little bit with keeping taking care of the basketball. This is a young team, as you said. They could desperately use Jared Reuter this year. I'm sure they're going to love having him next year, and they're going to bring back pretty much every big piece from this team. So certainly a team that's on the rise going forward, and I'm really excited to see their development. And it's gonna be a fun tournament out at the A10. And then I'm also just interested because maybe it's just because I have a lot of followers from the WAC, so I wound up seeing a lot of WAC basketball on my Twitter feed. But I'm really interested to see what kind of plays out there. Seattle U's had a great season in year one of Jim Hayford. They've got to go play New Mexico State tonight, but I think they can give them a test. And then a really tough battle between Grand Canyon and Utah Valley. I think a lot of people are kind of hoping for that Grand Canyon versus New Mexico State matchup in the championship game just because of all the animosity between those two clubs and potential for an upset there with Grand Canyon. I know they're starting to play a little better. And I tell you what, Grand Canyon has a freshman big. I was watching them yesterday, named Alessandro Lever from Italy. That kid is unbelievably good. His stats this season, he's only averaging about 12 points a game, but I'm going to pull it up now. Over the last, it's a certain window of games, he's averaging some ridiculous numbers for a freshman big man. I am super excited about this kid going forward. Let me just pull that stat up real quickly here. But yeah, he just kind of burst onto the scene, this kid from Italy. Had some high major looks, but I didn't really expect a freshman big to kind of put up numbers like that right away. So yeah, so since January the 18th, Alessandro Lever is averaging 19.5 points, 6 rebounds, 2 assists on 50% from the field and 32% from three. While getting to the free throw line, he got to the line 17 times yesterday, 10 times a game before, 8, 15, there's a 16 in there. He's already a beast, and he's only going to get better.
Yeah, I haven't seen a ton of Grand Canyon this year, but I wrote a preview for them this summer. They have two other really good recruits who haven't played as much in Damari Milstead and Robert Blumbergs. I know that Blumbergs had an opportunity to go play for Creighton and chose Grand Canyon. And then Oscar Freyer has a really bright future. He's like a very athletic wing player. I think a former Cal commit. Josh Braun, who is their best player, kind of has had a down season this year. That's why they're not at the top of the conference like they were previously. But they could certainly pull off an upset over New Mexico State in this conference tournament. And then I also wanted to mention Utah Valley in the WAC. They have a pair of 7-footers. They have Akolda Manyang, who used to play for Oklahoma, former, I think, number 2 JUCO player in the country. For a WAC team to have that much size, and both of their 7-footers are seniors, and that's a very advantageous point in their favor. They also have Kenneth Ogby, who's a former Utah Ute, and they have a ton of BYU transfers. So that's another example of using that at transfer market, to kind of raise your profile in a mid-major league.
Yeah, it's interesting. Mark Pope has done a really good job building this thing up. It's been really tough to him like that. Not really in exactly a booming area for talent, but he's done a good job of bringing in these transfers, and the future's bright out there for sure. Out in Utah.
Yeah, they have Brandon Randolph, who's played for Xavier too. I think Jarrell DeBerry was a transfer from the MAC.
Yeah, so, Kent State, I believe.
Yeah, so they've done a great job of assembling talent and being able to compete with teams like New Mexico State and Grand Canyon, who have better facilities and fan support.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the future is certainly bright for Utah Valley. So, kind of on from the game action, a team that will not be playing any more games this season is Pittsburgh. The Panthers have finally parted ways after 2 seasons with Kevin Stallings, finishing the season on a 19-game losing streak. Stallings will retire from coaching, is the report from Pittsburgh Sports Now. I just read a couple of hours ago. And so, Brad, I think, to me, this is the right move for everyone, just to kind of move on. I think it was at a point where the animosity was so high between the fan base and the coaching staff that it was just going to be difficult to ever get over that hump. What are your kind of thoughts on the move? I know it's tough to fire a guy after only 2 seasons, but this is certainly no simple case.
And so I had asked, I think either Sam Vecini or Matt Norlander on Twitter in the preseason, if Stallings, was going to get a 3rd year, and they were like, no way he gets fired after 2 years. But I mean, looking at this roster, you kind of saw it coming that this was an 0-18 team, and I think it was absolutely the right move to fire Stallings. It is worth noting, I saw an article today that they're going to try to fire him for cause based on when he yelled at the Louisville fan, like, at least we don't pay our players $100,000. That's going to be like their argument. So either they want him to take half the buyout, so like $4.5 million, or they're going to try to fire him from cause and get him nothing. So, I mean, it's tough if you're Stallings, if just take that lower buyout or risk getting nothing. I mean, $5 million is a lot, even if you were promised $10 million. I mean, the risk of getting nothing. I think I might, give into their strong arm and just take the less money. But in terms of potential replacements, I saw an article from Sporting News the other day, whose the candidates that they listed were just completely unrealistic. I think the only kind of big name guy that you could potentially get would be Kevin Willard and from Seton Hall, and I don't even think that that's a very likely scenario.
Yeah, I will say that I did hear Willard's name in terms of there being some mutual interest there. I believe it was in late January when there was first kind of this discussion of if Pitt opens, that Kevin Willard would be interested in Pitt, which I think is an interesting suggestion. I think, in my opinion, I don't know if Pitt can do better than Kevin Willard. I think Pitt might want to do different than Kevin Willard. I mean, I think Willard would win them some games because I think he'd recruit pretty well. But, I don't think of Kevin Willard. When I'm thinking of Pitt needing right now, I think they need someone who's going to build this thing from the ground up and be like a program builder who's there for a long time. That's why I don't understand these Thad Matta rumors. I just don't think Thad Matta is going to be there for 10 years and build Pitt basketball back to where it needs to be. I think, and he's not a guy I think who's going to come in, bring in a bunch of top recruits and grad transfers and whatever, and make them immediately ready to go. I think Kevin Willard's a guy who will get them to a certain level of relevance, but I don't know that he's necessarily the guy to bring them to the top. And so from that perspective, I think it's interesting, although I think they could definitely do worse. Like, I don't love it, but I think, like, if you hired Kevin Willard, I wouldn't be like, wow, that's a bad hire. I think it'd be like, okay, like, I'd give it like a solid B. The name I like here is John Becker from Vermont. He is a guy who, in my opinion, there's no coach better in college basketball that I've watched on a regular basis. at taking his players and absolutely playing to their strengths and getting everyone to star in their role, if you will. I think the concern you'd have with Becker is just, is he going to recruit, because he hasn't really recruited at a high major school, and he's going to have to go get talent. But he has some good ties in the state of Indiana, which could be a nice resource for him. He grew up and played college basketball in the Baltimore area at Catholic University, so he's a guy who could go into that, at least try to make some inroads in that area, which is such a hotbed of talent. And I think he could bring in a staff, whether it's, I know that they thought that there's been talk about Brandon Knight maybe getting the head coaching position there. I could see him being a lead assistant there, leaving Rutgers and doing that and being a recruiter for them. They would definitely need a staff that could recruit, but John Becker would be a really solid game coach. I think he'd build it from the ground up there. He's a program builder.
Yeah, I'm a big John Becker guy. I think another guy kind of in that same vein who could make a move would be Mark Schmidt from St. Bonaventure. You know, they're losing, I think, 3 starters. They're definitely losing Mobley and Adams, so next year they could take a step back. I don't know if he could get a bigger job. You know, Pitt's an ACC school. I know he was passed up, I think, for the Boston College job when it opened most recently. But I think he used to coach it at Robert Morris, so that's kind of a connection there. So Schmidt could be a good look. But like a lot of these 8 candidates that they kind of posited on the Sporting News article, why even mention Sean Miller? Like, we get it. He played there. He's not going to Pitt. Tom Crean, I don't think is going to Pitt. Thad Matta, I mean, Ole Miss is such a more attractive job at this point than Pitt, with all that football money from the SEC. Eric Musselman, I think he can do better than Pitt. Dan Hurley, I think UConn would certainly be a preferable move than Pittsburgh. And then Nate Oates, I guess I could see, and then Ed Cooley's not leaving Providence for Pitt. So yeah, not a whole lot of realistic choices on this eight person list.
Yeah, no, I don't really know. I think Schmidt's a pretty realistic option. I think Nate Oates is a guy. He signed a contract extension yesterday, but if they have, they just spent $9 million on a buyout is what they're committing to if they can't fire him for cause. I think they can afford whatever buyout Buffalo will have in his contract if they want to make that move. Maybe a John Brannon as well from Northern Kentucky. I think you have to call Eric Musselman. I think there's a better shot than you might think that he could pull it. It's not a great geographic fit, but it's a pretty big opening, and it's a place where I think you can win. And I think his vision for that program could fit nicely with how they want to build it, because he could bring in some transfers, bring in some excitement, play that up-tempo pace and space style that Nevada plays right now. And I think that's very attractive to Pitt. It's an interesting one. He's a native of Ohio, so he could potentially go into that area and recruit. He's recruited really nationally at Nevada with basically going to the transfer market. So, from that perspective, I think it could be really interesting to see the fit there. I hope he doesn't go there, because it's going to take time, and I want to see what he can build at Nevada. I know everyone's going to say Tom Crean or Thad Matta. I don't love those names, although I think Crean could do a solid job. And I like Schmidt as well, as you mentioned. I think he's a solid coach.
So another really interesting coaching search, or like coaching speculation, is with Colorado State, who fired Larry Eustace after a few down seasons and these allegations of player mistreatment. So the 3 big names that I've seen are Craig Smith, who's a head coach at South Dakota, who's done a very good job there. Nico Medved, who is currently the coach of Drake and was at Furman before, where he did a really nice job at Furman, and he had a solid first year in the Missouri Valley at Drake. Both those guys are former Colorado State assistants. And then the last candidate was Becky Hammon, the former WNBA superstar and current San Antonio Spurs assistant coach. So Kevin, did you have any thoughts on this Colorado State coaching search, and if Becky Hammon would be a legitimate or a preferable candidate?
Yeah, It's interesting with Becky Hammon because I mean, she's an alum of Colorado State, and this seems like a pretty decent chance for her to break into the coaching, in terms of a head coaching job, because I'm not sure an NBA team would hire her as a head coach, but at the same without any head coaching experience. But at the same time, I sit back and I wonder how does this all work out? A, does she want a Mountain West job? I mean, it's not an easy job to win in Colorado State. I think you can win there, but I don't think it's like a slam dunk job where she comes in, wins 20 games every year, and then wins a championship. And then I also think there is a hurdle with recruiting, that's different. The problem is she need to build a staff of people who understand her, but also can go out and recruit, because I don't think you can bring in just like a recruiter extraordinaire to come sell them on this program, because there might be just some apprehension regarding playing for a female coach. I don't think it should be a problem, but I think it's something that would definitely come up in a recruiting process. So I think you'd really need the right staff for it to work. I think she'd obviously do a really good job there in the end, because I think she's a really great basketball mind, but I think the recruiting hurdle, having not done that, if she was a college assistant now, I'd have a little more confidence. But because she's never had to go recruit talent, and there might just be a hurdle there, I think it's a really interesting setup. My gut says she doesn't wind up with the job, although my gut also says Colorado State does offer it to her. I think Craig Smith's the fit there, from South Dakota. He did a really good did a really good job with the Coyotes this season, although they did fall to South Dakota State in the conference title game.
Yeah, I completely agree, especially with the fact that Craig Smith should be the candidate. I think South Dakota ended up in like the top 70 in KenPom, so they could still be in play for an NIT berth. Kind of an outside chance at that. But even beyond like the gender aspect, I'm never really in favor of just hiring a NBA assistant with no college experience for a college head coaching job. I know, that's what Georgetown did with Patrick Ewing. And I remember when UMass was doing their coaching search, Micah Shrewsbury from the Celtics was a candidate, and he had coaching experience at Butler as an assistant. But when there's these guys who have been recruiting, are currently in the college game, and have shown it's like some level of success at the mid or low major level, as a head coach, I think that's a lot safer and a lot, a better chance of being a successful hire than just, pulling this random NBA assistant. I think New Mexico or New Mexico State was looking at this. I think his name is James Borrego, who's a former or current Spurs assistant. But when there are these guys currently in place who have ties to your program and have been successful at the mid-major level, I think it's too big of a risk.
Right. Yeah, I think Colorado State has a nice list of candidates just because they have guys who've worked for them now who are in a position to make a move up in the coaching world. And I think it's a natural time for one of those two guys, whether it's Medved or Craig Smith, to take that job. I know also Randy Ray's been interviewing at UTEP. I think he's another guy who'd fit. Done a really good job at Weber State. So I think they have a decent list of candidates out of Colorado State, and that should be an interesting job.
Yeah, and then you mentioned the UTEP job, and I was really surprised at the level of candidate that they were able to interview. I know you mentioned Randy Ray, who I thought would be a better fit in like the Mountain West than Conference USA, just based on like geography of where Weber State is. But Ray Harper from Jacksonville State was another guy that was supposedly interviewing for the job. And then who was the third candidate?
They had Ray Harper. They had Steve Forbes, although he already said no. Joe Dooley interviewed. They had Rodney Terry interview as well from Fresno State, which is interesting. And then they had Texas Tech assistant Chris Ogden, who also has worked under Rick Barnes at Tennessee rather, and then Greg Foster, who played at UTEP as an assistant for the Bucks now. So some interesting candidates. Personally, I'm not going to consider Joe Dooley a serious candidate for any job until he takes one, because I'm fairly confident he interviews for every single head coaching vacancy. Like there's probably like a local high school in Fort Myers that he's like interviews for just to see if he'll get it or not. I'm convinced he interviews for every single job, every single offseason. So like I apologize if someone says that he's a candidate, because right now I just don't think we know.
He was going to take the lead assistant job at NC State, like going from a head coach like to an assistant just because it was more money. And I think NC State ended up going with Heath Schroyer, who was the coach of I think Tennessee Martin. So I think his main motivating factor is money in this. I don't think the title means as much because UTEP and Florida State, while Conference USA is certainly a stronger league, I think Florida Gulf Coast, being the top job in the Atlantic Sun and having a lot of brand equity with their pretty recent tournament run, I think that's the preferable job, and I think he could even get a better job than UTEP, which is a bit of a rebuild.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the thing with Joe Dooley as well is it's difficult for me to question, because this report came out, I believe it was either Monday or Tuesday, that Dooley had interviewed for this job, and the championship game for his own conference was on Sunday. I mean, was he interviewing for this job on Saturday? I believe I saw that rumor. I'm not entirely sure if that's the date that it happened, but I think it just rubs me the wrong way that you have, within a couple of days of your championship game, you're still interviewing for other jobs. I question. I guess I do question his motivations a little bit, as you said, considering an assistant job. I know he looked at UMass last year. I know he looked at several other jobs. I think he interviewed at Wright State of all places a couple years ago. I'm convinced he really just looks around at every job, sees what they'll pay him, and sees if they'll offer him the job. Which, like, I guess people do in other industries, but it just rubs me the wrong way as a basketball coach. I guess the guy who's recruiting kids to come be in their program for 4 years.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think probably the third most interesting job open is Missouri State, which we were talking before that we went on air, that haven't heard many candidates. It's tough because the Missouri Valley is in a spot where it's technically a mid-major league, but you could probably get a mid-major coach from another league to switch to that league. I know we saw with Brian Wardle left Green Bay to go to Bradley, which was kind of a questionable move at the time, but he's gotten Bradley in a better place. I'm guessing that they're paying him more, or like that money was a motivating factor. I don't know if a guy like TJ Otzelberger would be willing to go to Missouri State from South Dakota State if like that's a bigger jump. Did you have any kind of potential speculation or ideas about where this coaching search could go?
Yeah, I had a name that I've seen kind of thrown around, not really as like a guy who's interviewed or anything, just kind of like a guy who could be in the mix, who I really like for this job, and that's Darren Horn, a guy who a few years ago was the head coach at Western Kentucky, and then at South Carolina spent, I believe, 6 years at Western Kentucky, and then 5 at Western Kentucky, 4 at South Carolina. He went to an NCAA tournament Sweet 16 and 2 NITs in his 5 years at Western Kentucky, won 20 games every year except his first one there, then kind of struggled at South Carolina, went to an NIT his first year, and then 3 straight sub-500 seasons. But a guy who's now at Texas. He's known as a very good recruiter. He's a guy who plays a very up-tempo system, when he was a head coach, and had those teams playing a really fun brand of basketball and a high scoring brand of basketball. I think he'd be a really nice fit there, where he could kind of get back into the head coaching business and head coaching ranks for a couple of years in an area where he's somewhat familiar in terms of his ability to recruit the Southeast and Southwest a little bit as well. I think it's a pretty solid natural fit.
Another guy, because I wasn't really considering assistant coaches, but like I should have. But Kansas assistant Norm Roberts, right? He used to coach St. John's. I mean, my only link there is you kind of got my wheels turning with Darren Horn, former high major coach, Norm Roberts, former high major coach, Kansas, Missouri, very close to each other. That's the only link I have, but maybe that's enough.
Yeah, no, it could work. Another name that I think he'd do a good job if you want it. Another name I heard kind of tossed around, this would be kind of out there. It'd be a little early, I think, but I've heard he really wants the job, is Kim English. I don't know if you remember him playing at Missouri.
Yes.
Was drafted by the Pistons in 2012, but he's kind of made inroads in the coaching profession, has spent 3 years at Tulsa under Frank Haith, and now is at Colorado. And I've heard he's a pretty solid recruiter. I'm sure he'd want that job because it's in the state of Missouri, an area where he's familiar. He's originally from the Baltimore area, so perhaps he could bring in some DMV recruits as well, combined with those recruits in the Southwest and in Tulsa and in the state of Missouri, which is I think a little more talented than a lot of people realize. So perhaps that could be a guy who at least gets an interview for this job.
That's a very good call, and also kind of reminds me of the rumor that Penny Hardaway could be the next coach of Memphis. While Memphis, I don't think is officially fired Tubby Smith yet. I heard on the CBS podcast that the verbiage of his contract allows them, instead of paying the buyout all at once, they can spread it over 6 years, which could allow them, to make a move this early. Tubby Smith kind of has squashed any recruiting momentum. They kind of have moved more toward 3-star and JUCO players, which is not acceptable for Memphis. And then, Penny Hardaway is the coach of a local high school team that has James Wiseman, who's the #1 player in 2019, and they have a few other very highly ranked recruits. So hiring Penny Hardaway could give Memphis the ability to quickly rebuild, kind of like what you were saying with Pitt maybe going after Eric Musselman and hitting the transfer market. Penny Hardaway could give them this elite 2019 talent.
Yeah, that rumor, I'm not really sure what to make of it, just because the Larry Brown aspect to me just is quite puzzling. I don't really know how that all works with Larry Brown being an assistant. I think he's got a bit big of an ego for that. Although, I mean, it could work, and they'd recruit like crazy because Penny'd bring in every good kid from Memphis. I think he'd keep them in the area, and he'd do a wonderful job there. The guy who I'd be worried about if I'm John Calipari is Penny Hardaway getting hired there, because he needs to be able to land those types of recruits in that area. And he would add another, the SEC's already got some recruiting momentum. If you were to add Memphis into the picture for these 4- and 5-star talents, that could kind of further muddy the waters for John Calipari as he tries to land these one and done prospects. So that's an interesting rumor. And then there's also this rumor that Tubby Smith, I think this has kind of been widely reported that Tubby Smith might go to High Point, because he's an alum of High Point, which my question is, like, High Point's a solid Big South job. Like, he could probably go to the NCAA tournament. But does Tubby Smith love coaching that much that he's going to go coach at High Point over retirement?
I think as long as they offer his son an assistant coaching job, he'll go.
That's a fair point, because Gigi just left Loyola, and now there's reports that potentially Jimmy Patsos could want to return to Loyola. He's on the hot seat at Siena. So it's kind of all coming together in one mesh where Gigi and Tubby form a dynamic duo at High Point. Patsos returns to his old stomping grounds at Loyola, Maryland. Let's Siena, who is less than enthused by, I think, Jimmy Patsos, at least their fan base is less than enthused, lets them move on. I think it could all work out nicely for all parties involved. What do you think, Brad?
Oh, I was talking about Saul Smith, right? Because he's the one that they fired Deidre Lawson's dad to hire Saul Smith, right?
Yes, that's an excellent point as well.
So they could get a complete Smith family staff with Gigi Smith, Tubby Smith, Saul Smith, and he's got to find one more.
God, that would be really, really funny. That whole staff just Tubby Smith's family coaching his alma mater as he attempts to bring them to a nice 15 seed in the NCAA tournament. It would be media day at the Big South. I saw one of my people I follow on Twitter, this guy named Brian, who covers the Big South as well as anyone, said he cannot wait for media day if Tubby Smith is the head coach at High Point, because every single other coach will have no one around them except for Tubby Smith, who will have the entirety of the media surrounding him trying to talk to the man. Unless
there's like one mad or one angry UMass fan going after Pat Kelsey.
The UMass fans' hatred towards Pat Kelsey is really interesting, given that they love Matt McCall.
One of my very good friends, goes to UMass, and when Derek Kellogg, punched the tournament ticket for LIU, I was like, hey, do you regret firing Derek Kellogg? He's like, no, we love Matt McCall, which, I mean, McCall's whole reputation is based off of his time as a Billy Donovan assistant, because at Chattanooga, he kind of botched last year. I mean, that was like the most talented team in the league, and they finished at like 10-8.
Yeah, no, I think Matt McCall has a good direction for that program, and he did a wonderful job with Chattanooga in 15-16. And then it was one of those situations where he had seniors, most of whom he didn't recruit as the head coach, and the seniors had all played together forever, and the chemistry just became like a complete and utter nightmare, and he like lost the locker room. And he did a good job this year, given all the circumstances. They had six scholarship players available. They were starting 2 walk-ons for most of the season. They had to grab a football player to give them some good minutes. It's just it was quite a mess this season, but they brought in some good transfers. I think the future is bright, and I've heard some really terrible things from UMass fans about what Derek Kellogg was doing in that program. So I think it was all's well that ends well. I guess he gets a job, and I think it was it was a good level for him, because he was recruiting well, but he just couldn't consistently put that into wins. He drops down a level. He got a kid, Derek Kellogg, to commit to LIU Brooklyn, who had an offer and took an official visit to Oklahoma within a month of his commitment. Like, it wasn't one of those where we got an offer from Oklahoma as a sophomore, and then they didn't want him anymore. Like, Oklahoma legitimately wanted the kid. So did Hofstra. And he landed him at LIU Brooklyn, the 7-foot big man named Usman Ndim from Aspire Academy in Kentucky. I was wow. Unbelievable. The guy can recruit. Don't know if he can coach, because they won 10-8 in the NEC with the best backcourt in the league. But they won the conference tournament, so all's well that ends well.
Just one last thing on this High Point job. I don't know enough about Scott Cherry to really know why he was fired, but just like looking at his record, his record wouldn't indicate someone who would get fired. I mean, he was 9-9 the past 2 seasons, but the previous 4 seasons before that, they went to either the CIT or the NIT, and they won their half of their North Division, both times. So maybe High Point heard through the grapevine that Tubby actually wants to come, and that's why they cleared some room.
Yeah, they've kind of trended in the wrong direction the last 4 years. They had the last 3 years, they had a really good run with John Brown, who was this talented kind of combo forward. And then they kind of went into this bit of a rut. I think they probably would have, you're right, kept him if they didn't think Tubby was a possibility. So yeah, that does kind of add fuel to the fire that this type of thing could happen.
So anything else you wanted to touch on?
Not really, man. I'm really excited for Selection Sunday. I think it's going to be a fun one, and there's certainly lots of basketball to watch. And we'll leave you all who are loyal listeners to doing that. Rather, I know you guys are taking your time out of your day to listen, and we really appreciate that. I think we should wrap it up with each having one hot take about the next 3 days of college basketball. What's your hot take, Brad?
That's a very good point, because I had wanted to mention this too. I think I saw on Twitter that UNC has 14 Quadrant 1 wins. So I think that they will get a number 1 seed regardless of the outcome of tonight's Duke-UNC game.
That's a very reasonable suggestion. And I also think it'd be interesting. I don't know if anyone has stats on this, but has there ever been a team that came in 6th in their own conference when you factor in tiebreakers to get a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament? Because that's quite incredible. What a crazy stat there. My hot-ish take is that Arizona State does not get into the NCAA tournament, and that Oklahoma State does. I don't know how hot that is. I think it's more warm, but I think a lot of people still kind of think Arizona State will get in. I'm going to have them as a no. I'll give you a second hot take just because I think it's probably not my first one isn't hot enough, and that is that Davidson wins the Atlantic 10.
I like it. I think Oklahoma State Well, this could be my second hot take. I think Oklahoma State avoids the first four. I think they get an 11 seed.
I hope you're right. I think they deserve it. We'll see what happens there. The RPI number is just kind of the hold back one. The committee can make a statement that the RPI is being de-emphasized by putting in Oklahoma State and even putting them in somewhat easily.
Yeah, I mean they just have so many good wins that to focus so much on you have to beat people, and then Oklahoma State does, and then to still leave them out because of an RPI. That just feels even a little too ticking time bomb to me than like the NCAA would be willing to do.
Right, and the problem is it's not like they have bad losses. Literally, the only reason why they're getting punished is their RPI is just bad because they played Pepperdine, Charlotte, Oral Roberts, Houston Baptist, Austin P, Mississippi Valley State, UT, Rio Grande Valley, and only winless conference team in college basketball, Pittsburgh. Their RPI was crushed by playing that non-conference schedule, but they won those games. They didn't even actually they beat Florida State in the non-conference on the road. That's their one big win, I guess, in the non-conference. Like, they did what they were supposed to do. I don't see punishing a team just because of who they played. They didn't play Georgetown's schedule. They made an effort to play some people. It's not their fault that Pitt was terrible. They went to play Texas A&M. They did play Wichita State. It's really a tough one for me.
Yeah, you can't put St. Mary's in and leave Oklahoma State out. It's either Oklahoma State has these big wins and played a bad schedule, or St. Mary's who played a bad schedule and has a lot of bad wins. I don't see how you could put the Gales in and leave Oklahoma State out.
That is an excellent point. I think it's a point we should wrap up this podcast on. Once again, guys, thanks for listening. This is probably our last podcast before Selection Sunday, unless something massive happens and we decide to record an emergency one. So enjoy your Selection Sunday, everybody. I'm sure we will be back shortly thereafter with our whole breakdown of it. Probably do some fun stuff with our picks for the tournament. There's going to be plenty of fun stuff on the way. Enjoy your college basketball weekend, and have a great day, everybody.